Welcome to the Heartful Parent Podcast. I'm your host, Christy Keating. In this podcast, we talk about it all, our parenting, our partnering, and our professional lives, because they are all a part of us, and we were never meant to do this alone.
Hello, friend, and welcome to the Heartful Parent Podcast. If you are a repeat and loyal listener, I am super thrilled and excited to have you back and grateful. And if you are new to the podcast, I want to welcome you. I hope that you'll stick around. I hope you'll find that there are things to learn and grow from here. Maybe a little bit of humor every now and then, and some things that, can help us all sort of relate on our parenting journey. This is a really exciting episode for me because it's episode 54. You might be like, 54? 54 doesn't mean much of anything. But here's the deal. Just last week on Valentine's Day, which is February 14th, of course, that marked the 1-year anniversary of the Heartful Parent Podcast. So last year in 2023, the podcast launched just after the Safe Parenting Summit, which is in May this year. And the podcast, because it's the Heartful Parent Podcast, and it was, following on the heels of the summit, Valentine's Day felt like a perfect day for launching it. So we have now been active and going week over week for a year plus, given that this is episode 54, and I could not be more thrilled. Before I dive into today's episode, a couple of things. First of all, I want to revisit and just kind of comment on the wonder that the year has been from where I sit as a podcast host, right? I have had the immense privilege to interview some absolutely phenomenal guests with, credentials that are just really incredible. So we talked with Dr. Jane Nelson back in episode 2, who Dr. Nelson is the founder of Positive Discipline, absolutely phenomenal. We've interviewed Dr. Peter Gray, who talks about the importance of play for our kids. We had, Laura Danger of That Darn Chat on the podcast talking about the equity in our homes and fair play and the need for us to really think about how we divide up the labor and the emotional labor in our families. We had Casey O'Rourke, who is not only a phenomenal coach of parents with teens, but also just a dear friend. And we also had Amy Lang, who talks about how do we talk to our kids about sex, right? We have heard from guests in Israel right after the hostages were taken there. We heard from a guest who is a parent coach in Pakistan and who is bringing a new style of positive, loving, connected parenting to Pakistani families. We've talked about grief. We've talked about online safety. We've talked about positive parenting. We've talked about stranger danger. We've talked about our aging parents and so many other things. We've blended talking about parenting, partnering, our professional lives, and so much more. And I'm so grateful to those of you who have been here for all of it, or those of you who discovered it along the way and have been joining in. And as I said just a minute ago, if this is your first time listening to the podcast, I'm thrilled that you are here. There's some great episodes you can go back and revisit, and more fabulous content planned for our second year on the podcast. With all of that in mind, there's a few things that are, I think, important for you to know as a podcast listener. I do this because I love the work that I do. I want to share free resources and wisdom with folks, but it costs money to put on the podcast. And that's fine. That's right. It's a business expense. And like I said, I do this because I love it. But if you value and appreciate what I'm putting out in the world, there are always two things that you can do. And the first is to share the episodes that are meaningful to you with people that you think can benefit from them. Encourage your friends to listen. Share with them about the podcast. Tell them how great it is and how much you love the variety of guests and topics that we cover. And number 2, drop a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts. That makes it so much easier for me to get this content out into the world, out into the hands of parents. And it makes it that much easier for me to have phenomenal guests who want to be on the show and say yes when I ask them. With that, I want to introduce you to today's guest, who is one of those phenomenal guests. And look, I have talked with incredible people. I have learned something from every single guest who's been on the podcast. And I have to say that today's guest is someone who I felt a great deal of connection with, a great deal of synergy with, because she and I, not only do we share some credentials and some background, but our perspective and our outlook on parenting and our families is just so in line. And we had such a good time talking with one another, both about her new book and just about our families in general. So our guest's name today is Lori Sugarman-Li. And Lori, like me, believes deeply in the power of families and is a passionate voice in the cultural shift aiming to articulate the value and the visibility of unpaid work. If you are a parent, whether you're a working parent or a stay-at-home parent or something in between, you engage in unpaid work. And Lori believes that we need to shed light on the value of it. She shares a story near the beginning of this interview that just knocked my socks off. And I work in this space. I know this stuff. And what she had to share was just mind-blowing. Lori's career as a communications strategist, combined with a decade devoted to full-time care of her family, community, and children's charities worldwide, served as the inspirational backdrop for her professional relaunch as a coach, a speaker, and an author. She is dedicated to fostering meaningful conversations within families, encouraging them to contemplate how they care for one another and their shared space. Lori, her husband, and their 2 sons are Canadian-born, but they live steps from Lake Michigan in Chicago. Lori has a new book out that she's going to tell you about, and I just think her philosophy and her approach and the work that she's putting into the world has so much value. So without further ado, I am so thrilled as we launch into the 2nd year of the Heartful Parent podcast to share my conversation with Lori Sugarman-Li with you. Have fun. All right, Lori, welcome to the Heartful Parent podcast. I'm so thrilled to have you here.
Thank you so much. I've been really looking forward to it.
You and I were just chatting a little bit before we hit the record button on this, and we have so many different things in common. We are both big advocates for the value of unpaid labor. We're both fair play facilitators. But I'd love to sort of start with asking, obviously I know about my own journey, but how did you kind of, what was your personal journey coming into that work? And how did you find yourself wanting to advocate for the value of that unpaid labor and ultimately write the book that, that we're going to chat about, which is called Our Home?
Thank you. So mine is a story of a big bubble bursting, and I'll go back to my 15-year paid career in marketing and strategy, which I loved. And I was working with Four Seasons hotels and resorts in the latter years of that. I had my first child in 2010, and in looking to go back to work after a mat leave, I was hoping for some flexibility with the work that was not on offer at the time by the company. And so I made the decision to take all of the passion and skills that I applied to my paid work and go all in on unpaid work. And so full-time care of my one, which became 2 small children, and all in on community contributions and volunteer and charity work. And I was really, really thriving in that space, loved it, felt so nourished, definitely felt valued by my family and my community. We ended up taking an opportunity to live in London, England. And so I moved my family overseas, maintained that same involvement there. And a second move brought us to Chicago, where I, again, was sort of intending on playing that role of community activist and getting involved in the school and head of the Parents Association, all these things that I was looking forward to doing. And every time we move, we need to renew all of our sort of foundational family documents. So wills and insurance and all that stuff. And we got health insurance and life insurance, of course. And my husband suggested to me, why don't we get you disability insurance? Because, God forbid something happens to you. He said, I'll take a leave and head the family. We are on our own when we make these international moves. We don't really have a safety net of family. It's really just us. And so if anything happened to me, he would have to jump in and we would need support. So I thought, great. And I engaged in the process of applying for the disability insurance and jumped through all the hoops and took all the medical physicals, all this stuff, all the forms, and was summarily rejected and told by the insurance agent that they don't value homemakers that high. And wow. I said, I'm sorry, excuse me. And he said, well, because you don't receive a salary for the work you do, you really don't fall on our algorithm. And I said,
can I just tell you, I feel my blood boiling as you say
that.
Right.
Okay. Right. Yeah. So, that cartoon where like smoke comes out of the ears and like flames come out of the nose. That is how I felt in that moment, that this, quote unquote, gentleman in middle America with his feet up on his desk was telling me that I had no value.
Wow.
And it really was the bubble bursting moment of recognizing the systematic devaluing of unpaid labor. In this country and beyond. I hadn't noticed it in the previous countries where I lived, but certainly this is a societal force. And It led me to, I had to write about it. It was like bubbling inside of me and I had to get it out. So I started writing. And it ended up taking form of an article entitled, "I Don't Get Paid, So What Am I Worth?" And I didn't know what to do with that article. And I thought, I didn't have any platforms, right? I was quote unquote a stay-at-home mom, right? Like just doing my thing, but recognizing I want to talk about this. Where do I go? And so I thought, what about LinkedIn? That's a place where I hadn't been before. Because back then in 2012, it was sort of like a job matching forum. It wasn't really the social media environment that it is now. But I thought, okay, I don't even have a LinkedIn profile. Like, what would I say? And so that was a cue to me, like, no, I have to be able to articulate what I'm doing now as work, as achievements, as growth in a way that any other working person would do. And so I created a LinkedIn profile for myself and I posted this article, and it started a conversation that led me to incredible things and amazing people who were also wanting to talk about this and wanting to work towards progress and solutions regarding this. And of course, it led me to Eve Rodsky and Fair Play. And I had to be a part of Eve's work. I just had to. She is changing the language of domestic labor. She is changing the value we apply to unpaid work. And it was everything that I needed to do in the face of this insurance agent, right? And so in recognizing I did not have a platform for impacting government policy or corporate C-suites or whatever, I thought, what can I do? What can I do? And I looked back at where I did feel I had credibility and all the work that I had done with my kids' schools and children's charities around the world. And I said, okay, I can talk to kids. And I was really driven by the ethos. If we seek to change adult behavior, let us show our children a better way. Of course, not knowing anything about the publishing industry, I decided that I would try to write a children's book. And I've been on this incredible journey, and now I have our home.
Okay, I feel like we could have a whole conversation about just what you've shared so far because I'm thinking, I think you said it was 2010
That's
when,
when my first child was born.
and is that when this rejection from the disability insurance came through?
It was a few years later than that. It was actually in 2018 that I
Okay.
had this conversation. So after a few years in Toronto, after a few years in London, and then moving to Chicago. So 2018 was the conversation.
I mean, that almost makes me even more angry because
Right.
we're not talking 15 years ago. We're talking, right, 6 years ago,
Yep.
less than probably,
Less than, yeah.
right? In the last 5 years, some man, and this, I say this with all the love for the men that we do love, but like, as you said, some guy, with his feet up on the desk who said, because you don't have a paycheck, you don't have value. And we know
Right.
that that's not true,
Right.
right? We know that if we were to categorize the work that stay-at-home parents do
Yeah.
and give it a dollar amount, it's actually an
Right.
incredibly high salary.
$10.9 trillion is the stated value for unpaid care work globally if measured at minimum wage. So debatable whether you can call this work minimum wage work. And I should also say that metric is for the executional part of the work that we see. It doesn't count the cognitive and the emotional labor that is invisible.
Totally.
So the value is tremendous. We know the value is tremendous. Those of us who are doing the work can feel like in our marrow how valuable this work is. And so we have to start to talk about it more. It's
We
not
do.
that it needs to be paid, but it needs to be recognized.
It needs to be recognized and valued. Yeah. And I have to say, even for those of us not doing the work, I mean, I am obviously doing the work of parenting. I've always been a working parent, but I say, and I'm guessing some listeners can relate to this. I had before I started my own business, I had an incredibly stressful job, right? I worked as a lawyer, I was a litigator, I was in court all the time. I was dealing with people who had done bad things.
Yeah.
And the days that I was at home with my children were harder
Absolutely.
than the days that I was at work.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's hard to articulate that sometimes.
Yes.
It's the grind of it, right? And it's the repetition and it's the heavy emotions but it's also the most beautiful work that we do. Right? It's the work of love. It's the work of nurturing. It's the work of nourishing. It's the work of, maintaining our investments. It's the work of adhering to, community standards and municipal standards and all these things that we do to protect our home, to protect our family and our children. I mean, even cleaning, like that is really an expression of gratitude for all that we have.
Right.
But it's the repetition, right? And it's the fact that we carry so much of the weight on our own.
Yes.
And we're doing it when we're tired.
Yeah. And we're growing adults. We're raising adults, right? Who are going to go out and influence the world. So, I mean, the ripple effect, aside from the cleaning and the cooking and as you said, managing investments and like keeping track of the school emails and doing all of those things. Like we're responsible, parents in general, but certainly stay-at-home parents are responsible for these little humans who will be adults in our world. So the ripple effect or the ripple impact of that is enormous. So for someone to say that it has no value is A, completely tone deaf, B, completely inaccurate, and C, just flat out offensive. So I love that you're channeling this. I'm feeling like as I said, when you first told that story, and I've heard a lot of stories about things like this, but that just, I mean, I can really feel sort of my own anger, rising up about that. But you found an outlet and a really beautiful outlet for that through the work of Fair Play. And you and I were just talking about a course taught through Stanford university's continuing ed that you have taken, that I am currently taking. And now you've written this beautiful book called Our Home. And for anyone, who are like, wait a minute, where do I get that? The book will be linked to in the show notes, so you can,
thank you.
find it.
That's great. Thank you.
Of course. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the concepts that you talk about in that book and just in the work that you're doing in general. And one of those is the idea of family flow. So that's a phrase that I'm not terribly familiar with. So talk to us a little bit about what you mean by family flow and how that impacts this work that parents are doing, this unpaid work.
So thank you for asking. I think I might have made it up, but it resonated with me as representing the daily cadence of a family, the schedule, the rituals, the considerations, negotiations, obligations, all of the ways that we move through the world together or in tandem, but in consideration and in support of one another in our little family unit. And it's fascinating to think about it, right? We're all in these little units, right? That we sort of like every day we have all these agreements about how we're going to exist together and support one another and, tick all the boxes that we want to tick to make that day the best that it can be. And all families have their own flow, right? They tell their own story and they can make their life whatever they want. But in order to do that, you have to have active and frequent conversations to ensure the alignment of values and alignment of goals and understand what it's going to take to make those goals a reality for you. And so that is flow. And it is all about keeping that flow from getting stuck.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I feel like I'm sure there are parents listening to this who are saying, well, in my house, there's not a lot of flow. There's a lot of clogs, right? Things just aren't feeling great. So, and I think this is going to be another area, Lori, where you and I are just seeing eye to eye on things.
Totally in sync. Yeah.
Yeah, totally in sync. But I'd love to have you talk a little bit more about those conversations. And for families who do feel like they're coming up against, a clog rather than a flow, how do we get those conversations started? And what are the things that are really important for families to be discussing?
So I think there's three main categories for me. And the first is really pertains to the visibility of all of this beautiful work that we do in the home and for the family and for the community that keeps us moving in the scope, because so much of it is invisible, right? So much of it, if you have smaller children, is done when the kids are napping or with the kids in school or, before or after they're awake. And so much of it, as we talked about before, is mental and emotional, that sort of stays, that ticker tape in the typically the default parent being the mom in her head constantly. And it doesn't really come out of there, right, to be seen and heard. And then also, in some cases, families are fortunate enough to have outside support coming in. And so, whoever that wonderful person is magically and silently doing all of this work, and it isn't seen, right? So there's this lack of understanding and lack of visibility of the scope of labor. So we have to start talking a lot more about that. And then I love to talk about the why behind the work. I think so often we have like a list of chores, right? And this word chore is like something that I struggle with. We can talk about that after.
Yeah.
But we have this like list of things, like obligations that we have to do. And we sort of just like dread them, right? But we don't often talk about why they're so important. And especially as it relates to conversations with kids, I find if you want to get them engaged in work, if they really understand like the meaning behind the task, they're so much more willing to be a part of it and to be the one that's generating that great outcome. As an example, if I were to say to my 13-year-old, okay, you need to change your sheets, he might be like, so annoying. Like, why do I have to do that? It's so annoying. But if I take him aside and say, hey, listen, I'm not sure if you knew, but having clean sheets contributes to having clear skin. And so maybe we should set it up where we change your sheets like every Monday or something, just to make sure that like your pillowcase is always fresh. Then he's going to be like, bet I am in. I'm in on changing the pillowcase. Like, just like, let me know. Right.
Yeah.
And if you have littler kids, for example, if you want them to go through their toys and maybe do like a purge or something to pass things along to charity, that might feel like a taking away for them, right? And that's like really a difficult thing. But if they understand more about who the recipients are and the benefit to those children and the impact of them having access to these books or these toys or these games, then they understand they're having a real impact to their community, and it takes on a different meaning. So these are the kinds of like layers of conversations that really can progress us sort of in having the value that we hope for this work. And then the last thing is the energy that we give to the language, right? So a chore is defined as a task that is unappealing, difficult, and tedious. So why do we choose to use that work to describe the work of love and care and gratitude? I don't know if we're going to be able to change the word, but we can definitely change the energy around it and focus more on this work being, the work of connection and the work of family contribution and the work of adding value to our space.
I love it. And, as you were talking, one of the things that was really resonating for me is what goes into those conversations with our children and our partners sometimes, right? About the why behind things. And I think many of us grew up in an era, or our parents grew up in an era, where it was a very authoritarian style of parenting, right? Do it because I told you to do it.
Yeah.
Right? Because I said so, like, don't ask any questions. You don't get a voice. You don't get a vote. And, as a positive discipline educator, we know, and the research is abundantly clear, that style of parenting is certainly no longer effective, if we could even argue that it ever was.
Right.
And that what really does make a difference, or what really does work, is building a culture of mutual respect. And this is something I talk about a lot. My clients hear me talk about a lot, is, are we being mutually respectful with our children? And the way you were describing those conversations about helping our kids understand why they need to change their sheets, why we're giving toys away, that feels fundamentally rooted in respect to me.
Yes, and intention, right? And also, you and I know from our connection to the fair play movement that when you look at your family as an organization and you impart the regular connections, like the weekly connect meetings that an organizational team would have, and when you treat people like a team and everybody has an important role and like makes a critical contribution, then you start to see that sort of more efficient, more effective flow, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as we always talk about with fair play, the idea is not to give people more work, right? When we say we're bringing in men more and bringing in children more into this work, the idea is to create an efficiency in your household and your family so that this work actually takes up less time and less space overall.
Yeah. Yeah. And then does, what, on the flip side of that, we then have more time to spend actually enjoying one another, or time to do the things that we value. The other thing that really struck me is, in the world of positive discipline, Dr. Jane Nelson, who pioneered that kind of way of thinking, she also doesn't like the word chore. And right.
Change that word.
Yes, it's a terrible word, because it does feel, because you're right. Like, the energy that we have put to that is at least historically a pretty negative energy.
Mm-hmm.
But she describes it as family work, right?
I love that.
Right, because then it also recognizes that we all have a contribution to make, which ties right into the need for belonging and significance, which is a conversation for, another podcast. But
we're going to need a part two.
Yeah, part two, exactly. It all just kind of flows together. So
Let's talk a little bit about, because I know there are parents listening to this who are like,
Mhm.
so wait a minute, this is about getting our kids to do some of the things around the house,
Yeah.
like to get them participating.
Yes,
Yes, it is.
it is.
But
Yeah.
beyond just explaining to them the why, what are some suggestions that you have, for getting started, maybe like setting a family agreement, or do you advocate that everybody is working on the tasks at the same time? Like, how do we kind of get started, especially for those families who might have slightly older children? And, as the parent of a teenager and the parent of a younger child, I definitely find that my younger child is generally much more excited
Yes.
about being involved than
Yes.
my teenager is. So,
Sure.
for those who have slightly older kids or teens who might be kind of initially resistant to this, how do we get that flow happening that you described?
So even though I have written a book for children, I think that this is a conversation. It's like a start where you are. So wherever you are with your kids, it's regrouping as a family and resetting on your values and understanding like how do we want to move through this life? Like what is important to us, what's not important to us? And then also what's really important is understanding the preferences of each family member in terms of the environment that they thrive in, right? We share a space, we share a home, but we don't all thrive in the same kind of space. And what I mean by that is, I am somebody who really craves and prioritizes order. And I have a son who really thrives. He's more of a nostalgic person. He likes to be surrounded by a lot of the things that are meaningful for him. His trophies and pictures and pieces of paper that someone wrote a nice note to him on. Like he likes having them all sort of out and about. And
Yes.
so while that is not the kind of environment that I thrive in, I don't want to impose my standards on him. I want to understand what works for him and then help him be his best that, right? So a standard that connects to the way he's wired and what he thrives in. And so it's having conversations about like, well, how do you like it to be? And what's important to you? And, do we have to make our bed every day of the week? Like, do we value that? Is that important to us? And, you know, what about food and cooking and all of these other things that we sort of think we have to do based on the judgments of others or what we think our community expectations or whatever, but it's really up to us to decide as a family, aside from of course adhering to basic health and safety. It's up to us to decide like how we want our home to be,
Mhm.
and involving kids in those conversations really helps them have a stake in it. I used to work in the food business. I used to work for Kraft Foods. And one of the insights that we had around cooking was that when you bring kids into the kitchen and get them involved in the cooking, they're so much more likely to eat that food that is prepared. And
Yes.
I think that's like sort of like a overarching like theme here. So if you bring kids in to the root of the conversation, give them a voice, trust what they say, empower them to let you know how they need it to be, then they're going to have more of a stake. And then what I love to do to really, help kids connect to certain tasks is make meaningful matches. And so, as an example, you always want to set a kid up for success, a child up for success. And it's really about empowerment and teaching and contribution. So, if they have a particular skill, so one of my kids has a really great mind for organization, I'm going to invite him in maybe to unload the groceries and organize them in the fridge and the pantry. So that's something that will be an easy task for him to complete. He's probably going to feel pretty proud of it afterwards. And then it's also like a huge teaching moment because he's going to look in the pantry, which he maybe otherwise wouldn't. And he'd be like, we had this. Can we try this? Can we make this? Right. And so that's what happens is the curiosity builds. My other son is a very enthusiastic eater. And we very often have a delightful pile of crumbs underneath his chair. So guess what? He's the kitchen vacuumer, right?
Yeah.
He makes the crumbs, he vacuums them up. He also is very motivated by listening to music. So the work that he does for the family are the things that allow him to have headphones on. right? So he
mhm.
can do that for the vacuuming as well. And then similarly, if you have a child that maybe will work better with a partner or a shadow, maybe they thrive with that sort of support. Work maybe like laundry or yard work, where it's more of like a team effort, would be more appropriate. And so setting them up for success and empowerment by matching to their skills, matching to their interests, and matching to their curiosities, I find can really be a good starting point.
I love that idea because I think many of us as parents, and I'm not going to exempt myself from this, we see the tasks that need to get done, and we just want to sort of rush in and like divvy those up. Let's just get it done without thinking through how to best not just get them accomplished, but also get our kids sort of willing to continue doing those things. And I'm not saying, and I would love to sort of hear your thoughts on this. I think my thought would be there will be times when our children have to do tasks that they don't love or that
For
don't
sure.
necessarily play to their strengths, right?
For sure.
But if we're at a jumping off point where our kids have had everything done for them, and I hear this a lot, right? That we just do for them. And so if we're trying to kind of get them at that jumping off point where they are willing to get engaged, starting with this sort of strengths-based approach that you're describing feels like an easier way in to that conversation.
It's so interesting what you just said, because I think a lot of people in this role of motherhood, right? And I have felt this too. We feel this obligation to perform the motherhood role to perfection, at a high standard. And that includes doing all the work and checking all the boxes ourselves and protecting everybody else from it.
Mm-hmm.
But you sort of reach a point where you see your kids growing up and you're like, you realize they're going to be independent soon, and then they're going to be partners. And how are we preparing them for that? So that's part of the caregiving role as well, right? Is that like letting the bird fly out of the nest and giving them all the tools that they need in which to do so. And so I think the earlier that we have these conversations, and young kids are so capable and they're so thoughtful, and they don't have this dread for this work yet that we have, right? Like they see it as an opportunity to be with us and to be doing important things and be doing grown-up things. And so the sooner you invite them in to begin to build that muscle, there almost isn't the space to like create a distance between them and the work.
Yep.
And they don't then define it as, oh, that's my mom's responsibility, or that's the housekeeper's responsibility, or whatever it may be for your family.
Yeah. As you're saying that and talking through that, and this idea that like our kids are going to, at least many of them, be partnered at some point.
Yeah.
And I have long been a believer that the way, stick with me here, because I know it'll feel like it's attenuated, or that this is a little bit of a stretch, but I don't think that it is. And in fact, in the Safe Parenting Summit that I host every spring, I always have a fair play person talking. And here's why. I think that if we are bringing our children of any gender, all genders, into the work of the family, and we are modeling from the top down a more equitable family dynamic, where, particularly in heterosexual relationships, if both mom and dad are engaged in the work of the family and valuing that work, that translates to a value of the individuals, right? Not just the work, but to the individuals, which translates to seeing girls and women as equals with as much to contribute. And I think that in turn, and I haven't seen research studies about this, but I would love it if there were some done. I truly believe that translates into a decrease in violence against girls and women.
And
Well, there is research. You're so right. And I followed you like step by step. I was like cheering over here because you're so right. And there actually is research, and I will send you the link, but it was a study on men that indicates when men are more involved in care, violence decreases, kids do better, and men's wellness increases. So you're spot on.
love that.
Spot on. And this is something that we need to share with our sons. We need to set them up for that, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's so interesting to see, right? Because I think if you look at younger parents now, and I see the younger generations of moms and dads, and you can see there has been an evolution toward fathers taking on more involvement.
Yeah.
It's clear. It's clear. And at first it kind of used to like delight me, right? And I would be like, oh, look at that great dad. And of course I was like, hello, stop. That's exactly what we're
Yeah.
if the mom was doing the work, would you say, look at that great mom? Well, I would, of course. But it's still, I think the shift is still primarily at the executional stage of
Yes.
the mental load still really heavily resides with the mom.
Totally. Totally. Yeah. I
So
love that there actually is research out there, and I would love to get that link. Yeah, and share it with the listeners, because I really, one of the missions of the work that I do, I want our children to grow up brain and body safe.
mhm.
And body safe means not the victim or the perpetrator of a sexual assault, right? And who grow into partnerships where they are valued and domestic violence doesn't exist, and all of those terrible things that I dealt with as a prosecutor.
Right.
I truly believe that the cure is in our families. And
Absolutely.
right. And so if our boys, and I again, I know this is a very gendered or sex divided conversation,
Yes.
and I don't intend it that way, but because we know that the majority of violence is perpetrated by men,
Mhm.
or those who identify as men, that if we are starting from the root level, as you described, right, in the flow of our families, then we are creating a culture where that cannot persist.
It's cycle breaking.
Yeah.
That's what we're doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And all of these conversations, they're not always easy to start and they're not always easy to have, but there are support systems for the language that can help you facilitate them. Fair play is one of them.
Yeah.
And there are frameworks for how to implement this kind of system into your home. And I'm hoping that my book for children is going to be something that sparks those conversations, that takes the pressure off of moms from, again, that emotional labor of trying to change this for her family. But the book will hopefully do the work. But yeah, we're breaking cycles. That's what we want to do.
We are. And I love that there is a book in this space, because, any parent can read it to their child and see sort of the overall benefit to the family, right? That doesn't need to be a book that just moms are reading, right?
100%.
Right?
Hopefully not.
Yeah, yes. In fact, we prefer it not that way, right? That any parent is reading, that we're all sort of getting on board with this idea. And it's super cute. The illustrations are really colorful, and it.
Thank you.
Yeah, and it just.
Thank you on behalf of my incredible illustrator. I cannot take credit for those.
Well, I appreciate that, but you obviously had some say in how this book went out into the world, and I think families will find that it really resonates, and it's as you said, I know it feels like a lifetime of labor for you to put the book into the world, but it is like such an easy in to this conversation for families.
Thank you so much. That's all I'm hoping for.
Well, mission accomplished. And so we'll make sure that families know how to track down that book. Again, it's called Our Home. And Lori, what ages would you say that book is appropriate for?
So I think it's like a 5 to 8, with the sweet spot being around a first grader, I say, because I love it as a book for someone who's still being read to, but also starting to read to themselves. And also, it's around that age where you see the magic of connecting to these tasks of care and tasks of home. But to be honest, I've had friends who have teenagers say to me, like, I'm buying the book. Like, I'm reading it to my 17-year-old just to have a way into this conversation. And I hope that, I hope that it becomes a part of baby lists and, and books that are read to really, really small children, just again, to spark these emotional connections and these family feelings that make us realize, again, all of this work is so grounded in gratitude.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a stretch, right, to think of cleaning the bathroom as gratitude. But if you do think about it, of course it is, right? It's maintaining this investment that we made in our beautiful house, right? Or like vacuuming the car. That is work of love, of caring for an investment and of gratitude for all the things that we have. And the sooner that kids are involved in this work, the sooner that they start to build the muscle.
Yeah. I am in the uniquely kind of awesome position that I have a teenager and a first grader, and I'm going to make my teenager read this book to the first grader.
Oh, I love that.
Right?
I love that. That's
as a way
beautiful.
Of getting them both. And I will say, like, my kids are pretty involved in the work of the home, but I love reinforcing that messaging. And, as you know, with a teenager yourself, like, there starts to be this countdown where you start to realize, oh, we only have X number of years left with this kid in our house. And, I need to send her out into the world capable of two things that I think are really relevant in this space. One, obviously taking care of herself in her own space.
Yes.
But two, when she's in a partnership.
Yes.
Knowing that she is deserving of her partner also taking care of the space that they share.
100%.
Yeah.
Yep. And sparking those conversations, early on in the partnership and establishing that respect and those expectations for sure.
Absolutely. Lori, I am just like, there are so many more things that you and I could talk about. And I think we are going to need to, at some point, do another conversation, because this,
I'd love that.
This idea, as you said, like, there's just so many little things I want to dive into down the road. For example, as you said, we were seeing a shift in caregiving, but it's still primarily execution that our partners are doing. Right. I think there's this question of the idea, why all of us as moms tend to overdo for our families. And that may be related to the fact that we had careers and we're used to high achieving there, many of us, right? So many more conversations that we could have, but this is such a great starting place. I'm so grateful to you for being on the podcast.
Thank you. I so enjoyed it. Can't wait for more.
I can't either. And I just want to sort of reiterate for everyone listening that if you are looking for a way into this conversation and creating a set of shared values around the labor of maintaining your home and your space and your family and creating that family flow that you talk about, this book is a great way into that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here, Lori. More to come.
I can't wait.
All right, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me today. Like I said at the beginning of this, I just really connected with Lori. I was and remain hopeful that you did gain a ton from this interview, that it was interesting and engaging for you. Lori is a really incredible advocate of all of us who are engaging in that unpaid labor, which, as I said in my intro, if you are a parent, you are engaging in unpaid labor. And if you are a mom, you are likely engaging in more of it than your partner. That's just the reality of our culture these days. If that's not your reality, awesome, congratulations. And if it is, I hope Lori's conversation really opened up some ideas and some thoughts about sort of the cultural where we sit culturally as a whole, and also really beautiful ways to help engage our children in the work of the family. Thanks so much for joining me. I'll reiterate, drop those 5-star reviews, share these episodes, and if you need additional parenting support, the Heartful Parent Academy is the place to get it. There will be information in the show notes about where you can join that. I always offer a discount for your first month to podcast listeners. So check out those show notes and join me in the Academy. I'll see you next week on the podcast. Cheers.